unmuted as yet, so hopefully they'll be able to sort that out in the next minute or so. So I am just going to introduce tonight's speaker. And also myself. For those of you who haven't been to any of these talks before, I'm Dr. Penny Bradshaw, and I'm Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Cumbria. And I organise these events as part of my role as theme lead for cultural landscapes, and that's within the university's Research Centre for National Parks and Protected Areas. So it's my very great pleasure this evening to welcome and introduce Dr. Anna Burton. Anna is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Derby, and she's a specialist in 19th century nature writing and environmental literature. Anna's recent book, Trees in 19th Century English Fiction, was published by Routledge in 2021. Her current research explores the cultural history of the rowan tree, which sounds absolutely intriguing, and also literary depictions of trees and tree spaces in the English Lake District. So tonight she's going to be talking to us about tree mountaineers, which I'm looking forward very much to finding more about. Tree mountaineers, tree places, planting and caretaking in 19th century Lakeland literature. And I'm sure you would all like to join with me in offering a virtual welcome to Anna. So I'm going to now hand you over to her, and I'll take myself off camera and unmute. Thank you very much, Anna.
Brilliant, thanks Penny, and thank you for inviting me to present my work this evening as part of the Cultural Landscape series, and thank you to all of you who've come along today to take the time to come and listen as well. So my paper today forms the initial findings of my new project, which I think would be helpful for me to sort of preface for you briefly before I get started. So this new project aims to rethink the literary, cultural and national significance of trees within the environs of the English Lake District. So using long 19th century Lakeland literature, including writings I'm talking about today by Dorothy and William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Harriet Martineau, alongside contemporary place writing by the likes of James Rebanks and George Monbiot as my sort of textual foci. This body of work will explore representations and expressions of planting, transplanting and caretaking of trees in this agro-pastoral region, past and present. And in doing so, this work responds to the pressing political and environmental need to balance tree planting, so for biodiversity and flood defences, in confluence with agricultural practices and traditions, which I'm sure, as many of you know, is a long-standing and particularly complex discourse in the Lake District and beyond. There we go. So underpinning this project is the concept of arboriculture, as defined by Owen Jones and Paul Cloke in their collaborative book on tree cultures. In this book, Jones and Cloke consider how trees and tree materiality play an active role in the formation of environment in the cultural imagination. So how the physical situation can both shape place and is also shaped by place, respectively. And thinking about this dynamic can help us understand how trees are perceived in cultural terms. So to quote Jones and Cloke, the processes by which trees become culturally meaningful will have significant implications for understanding how places and landscapes are imagined, and for processes of environmental management, where those working with trees will be continually confronting the complex symbolic and emotional freight attached to trees in any particular place. So, understanding how we perceive and attach meaning to trees in different environments, so their materiality, their shape, situation, and characteristics, is vital because it informs our ongoing perceptions of them, how we understand and treat them, and the environment more widely. So, using this concept as a starting point, I'm going to look at different kinds of trees and tree places in the ongoing and historical geographies of the Lake District, look at accounts of and depictions of kind of planting and caretaking of trees in villa gardens, arboreta and orchards, as well as the afforestation of mountainsides, farmland, and the treatment of pre-existing woodland spaces. I think the Lake District is a particularly significant case study in this respect, as the natural and the cultural, the human and the non-human are inextricably intertwined in a number of complex ways in this region. And with regard to my talk on tree mountaineers today, I'm going to present some early thoughts on the first part of this project and focus on literary expressions of trees and afforestation on the Lakeland fells in the 19th century writings of William Wordsworth, Dorothy Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Harriet Martineau. And in particular, I'll be focusing on prose guides, journals, notebooks and letters of these authors in order to explore how and to what purposes these altitudinal arboreal spaces were viewed and how these perceptions evolved at a time when the cultural formation of this mountainous region was evolving at a great pace. So firstly, and in relatively broad brushstrokes, I'm going to consider how the historical treatment and geological configuration of higher ground in the lakes impacted on the caretaking and planting of trees for both agricultural and aesthetic purposes in the 19th century. And then secondly, I'm going to move to higher ground in my consideration of tree mountaineers. So this is a term and concept coined by John Muir in 1869 to describe individual specimens existing and enduring for more than a score of centuries at a high altitude. So for the purposes of my research, I'm applying the term to comparable descriptions of trees in 19th century literature focused on the Lake District. This is in order to think about perceptions of non-human, specifically arboreal, materiality and agency, and its imagined and physical articulation within this agro-pastoral region. And much more than this, how the cultural framing of these trees and how we view and anthropomorphize them shifts within different areas and altitudes of the Lake District. And I believe that in understanding these cultural and physical intricacies at a localized level can transform how we see tree spaces and trees in the region and our sort of continued treatment of them and this landscape. So to the talk itself then, I'd like to begin a little closer to our present time. In 1989, the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology, which is part of the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology today, published a collection of essays investigating the diversity of Cumbrian woodlands, past, present and future. And a number of essays in this work, and notably from different focuses, highlight the tension between intensive agricultural practices and arboricultural regeneration. So in discussing the composition of Cumbria's woodlands, Bunce admits that there's little doubt that heavy grazing pressure is the primary limiting factor for regeneration. Meanwhile, in an exploration of the region's flora and fauna, Kirby and Whitbread suggest that whilst grazing and browsing animals have, to a large extent, always been part of Cumbrian woodlands, recent high levels of stock use in relation to the area of wood available reduces the diversity of ground flora with a shift to grasses and away from broadleaf species. Sapling growth is also prevented. So there's a sense, as we now know, that in particular that more intensive farming practices have resulted in less woodland in the Lake District. Non-human enterprise has shaped tree spaces in the region, but this is not simply a case of farming versus tree planting. It's much more complex than that. As James Rebanks's recent book, English Pastoral, has illustrated and made clear, it's very much intensive farming that results in a loss of Lakeland biodiversity and variety of species, arboreal and otherwise. However, this isn't simply a modern concern. So in their respective 19th century guides to the region, William Wordsworth and Harriet Martineau draw attention to the treatment of trees in the Lake District and make their own assessment of the impact of human and agricultural endeavour on upland forest cover. So in Wordsworth's Guide to the Lakes, he suggests that formerly the whole country must have been covered with wood to a great height up to the mountains. And he encourages his reader to imagine these narrow dales and mountainsides choked up as they must have been with wood. So Wordsworth meditates on a very different version of the Lake District, one overwhelmingly characterised, choked up even, by tree cover. He then admits that in his present moment, the region's woodlands only exist in the form of native coppice woods that have been protected by enclosures, and in the scattered forest trees and hollies that remain. Wordsworth makes the case that the woodscapes of the area are fast disappearing and only, in his now and then, exist in a more limited sense. That being said, it's only through long-standing enclosures that even coppice woods still exist. Any other kind of tree outside of man's influence are scattered at intervals across the landscape. And Wordsworth doesn't blame or condemn agricultural practices for this. In fact, it appears that man's intervention, cordoning off and cultivation of trees is a primary reason for its remaining existence in some form. And in a similar movement in her Complete Guide to the English Lakes, Harriet Martineau reflects on the Cumbrian woodland of olden times. Firstly, she imagines the Roman pioneers felling the trees and paving the way on high streets, while the trembling natives cowered in the forest below. Elsewhere, she discusses that same landscape after the Norse arrived in the 10th century, the shepherds browsing their flocks on the sprouts of the ash and the holly with which the uplands were then wooded, and protecting the sheep from the wolves which haunted the thickets. So for Martineau, like Wordsworth, these woodscapes of the past overwhelms the uplands and lowlands of Cumbria, an image that both authors acknowledge as vastly different to the current state in the first half of the 19th century. And whilst they both depict a transition from heavily wooded fells and valleys to a more scattered arboreal presence, Martineau more explicitly connects this transition to human intervention as a result of felling and browsing. Undoubtedly, though, both authors are utilising the discourse of primitivism here to evoke and kind of romanticize a long distant arboreal past, and that includes the treatment of those spaces too. Much more than this, Martineau goes on to compare current farming practices with past depredations. She says that current shepherds cherish the young hollies and ash whose sprouts feed their flocks, thus providing a compensation in the future for the past destruction of the woods. Thus, while the general primitive aspect of the region remains and its intensely rural character is little impaired, there is perhaps scarcely a valley in the district which looks the same from one half century to another. So, for Wordsworth and Martineau, the Cumbrian woodlands of the past are vastly different to the treescapes that they go on to detail elsewhere in their own guides. But for Martineau in particular, there's an admission that in the current moment, agricultural practices have evolved for the better. Martineau concludes that current shepherds and farmers take better care for the trees that feed their flocks, and through this even make up for the past destruction of the woods that she previously outlined. They are providing a compensation and investing in the future of these woodlands. The author is intensely aware of the role of human intervention and of how that impacts on the treatment, shape, and longevity of the region's trees. Furthermore, whilst the primitive aspects and intensely rural character remain, there's an awareness that this is an environment that changes from one half century to another. This is a landscape of arboreal change and fixity all at once. It's less heavily forested than in its primitive past, but various forms of woodland continue to exist and be cultivated therein. Moreover, it's clear that the geological formation of this region is central to its arboreal character and caretaking as presented in these writings. Trees provide a significant link between the valleys and higher ground, and notably, mountainsides provide an additional terrain on which to plant trees for various purposes. As Martineau continues in the Complete Guide, generations of men plant their orchards on the slopes which connect the mountains with the levels of the valleys. Elsewhere, in a letter to a friend in 1801, Samuel Taylor Coleridge remarks that oak trees thrive uncommonly well and in very bleak and rocky places in the lakes. And this is important to those living off the land, as when the corn crops fail, A plantation of oaks on the fells provide acorns on which there might be 20 families maintained. Coleridge claims that when the mountains are struck with drought, the valleys give corn. When the valleys are rotted with rain, the mountains yield acorns. And as these writers suggest, in the 19th century, trees here are important to a network of agro-pastoral ecosystems that occur at different altitudes and microclimates from one valley to the next. Furthermore, moving beyond the concerns of agriculture, trees on the fells also become an important part of the aesthetic and picturesque register for evaluating and framing Lakeland topography at the time. On their travels, Martineau and Coleridge record various observations on the visual impact of wooded fells. Take, for example, when Coleridge records his Lakeland wandering in his notebooks. On a number of occasions, he refers to the treeage of Waller Crag. It's wooded up to the top and very black and green. Elsewhere for Martineau, going up one's fell means climbing up through its wood, and this in itself forms part of the scenic views of the climb. She says, between the trees, as we proceed, noble views open upon us of the two valleys at the head of the lake. So Martineau's view of the scenery from this vantage point is framed by the trees, forming picturesque side screens around the view. And in both cases here, this treeage on the fells, as Coleridge terms it, is in many ways described as a kind of homogeneous entity of unnamed species that add colour, perspective and variety to a mountain scene. Nevertheless, as contemporary writings show, the planting and aesthetic value of particular species on fells became bound up with an increasingly politicised discourse in the 19th century, in particular when it came to the introduction and proliferation of one particular tree, the larch. In travelling through Matterdale in 1799, Coleridge observes that the whole huge tract of it is treeless. He notes a distinct absence of trees, and whilst the terrain is admirably adapted for wood, he ponders who would take the trouble to plant it. This in itself suggests that the valley isn't worth the trouble, something I'm sure James Rebanks would take issue with now. Nevertheless, half a century later, Harriet Martineau refers to arboreal developments on Melfell, presumably Great Melfell, pictured here on the slide, in Matterdale in her complete guide. It is the ugliest of hills, like a tumulus planted all over with larch. The fell is likened to a man-made burial mound rather than a natural formation of any significance. Much more than this, it's the ugliest of hills, made worse by being planted over with larch trees. The trees reinforce rather than alleviate the unappealing aesthetic of this Matterdale fell for Martineau. Now, this perspective seems to be a continuation of William Wordsworth's famous consideration of this species in his Guide to the Lakes, wherein he writes against the inclusion of the larch and other exotics into these regions. Wordsworth notes that certain trees have been introduced within these last 50 years, such as beeches, larches, limes, etc., and plantations of firs, seldom with advantage and often with great injury to the appearance of the country. In particular, Wordsworth goes on to isolate the larch and criticise those who plant it, not merely with a view to profit, but in many instances for the sake of ornament. He's incredulous that such vegetable manufacturing, as he terms it, is planted in the Lake District, not just for utilitarian purposes or for timber, but for aesthetic appreciation too. Furthermore, this spiky tree, as he calls it, is no better in a grouping, as it causes nothing but deformity collectively. So I'm sure many of you may already be familiar with Wordsworth's discourse around this particular tree, and various literary critics have scrutinised his opinions and the language of injury and deformity that he uses on this topic to different ends. So Ian H. Thompson makes the case that through such statements, he demonstrated a pre-ecological understanding of natural processes such as colonisation and succession, and an unerring eye for the patterns of nature. So Thompson sees Wordsworth's statements through a proto-ecological lens, that his comments signal a kind of sensitivity to the ecosystem of the Lake District. Scott Hess sees Wordsworth's opposition as being not for ecological reasons, but because they introduce signs of human industry and ownership that would violate his aesthetic construction of the Lake District. So Hess perceives such statements as a means of asserting a kind of cultural authority over this environment, whereas Andrew Hazuka's work on the subject is a kind of intermediary between these two perspectives, that whilst the guide should be read as an alarmist call for a more sustainable local ecology, it should also be seen as an exercise in nationalistic rhetoric. For Hazuka, Wordsworth's statements show an awareness of his environment and the ecologies therein, and there's also evidence of a form of ecoxenophobia, which is a fear of exotic or non-native plants superseding and taking space amongst native species. And I certainly concur that Wordsworth's guide can be seen as an environmental text, but also that the language he uses around the larch is certainly problematic and indicative of the unhelpful language surrounding native and non-native plants more generally. But I don't simply want to reiterate these sort of well-trodden findings. I'd like to build on this pre-existing work. And in many respects, what Wordsworth took issue with was the specific placement of the tree and the presence of the larch as a somewhat unnecessary substitution for native broadleaf species. However, through the Wordsworth's acquaintance with John Marshall, a wealthy flax spinner from Leeds, who consulted William Wordsworth on his purchases of land and woodland in the lakes, Wordsworth cultivated and advanced his perceptions of appropriate tree planting and caretaking in these environs. Though they weren't fast friends to begin with, as Christopher Donaldson notes, both men agreed about the way their land should be maintained. Both were adamant about the importance of naturalistic design about the cultivation of native species, including hardwood trees. So there was a strong similarity in their views on and passion for cultivating trees in this region. And after viewing the Duke of Athol's extensive planting in Scotland, Marshall wrote the following to Wordsworth. The larch thrives in all dry situations and thrives most in high exposed ones, even amongst the rocks where there is little or no soil and where scarcely any other tree will grow. In low situations and deep soils, the larch grows fast but produces timber of little value, it being nearly all sap. On the mountains, it grows more slowly, but it is nearly all heart and is valuable timber. On their accounts, the Duke of Athol now plants all his high mountain grounds with larch, but plants none of these in the lower grounds where other trees will thrive. So Marshall remarks that the larch grows at a slower pace in high exposed situations where scarcely any other tree will grow. There's somewhat hardy trees that do well where the soil is poorer, and for this reason, like the Duke of Athol, he advocates the planting of this tree at higher altitudes. And whilst it might have been somewhat grudgingly accepted, these ideas about the placement of the larch influenced William Wordsworth. In a letter of this period, Dorothy Wordsworth writes, "My brother has made great use of Mr. Marshall's observations on planting. He recommends to everybody to plant larches on their high rocky grounds and oak, ash, etc. on their rich low grounds." Equally, in Wordsworth's guide, there's a rather strained entreaty that native deciduous trees may be left in complete possession of the lower ground, and that plantations of larch, if introduced at all, may be confined to the highest and most barren tracts. So for Wordsworth, as long as broadleaf trees retain custody of the lower ground, the larch can appear to advantage at elevated sites. And this suggests that for Wordsworth, and more generally, the higher and lower places of the fells were viewed against different kinds of aesthetic standards and cultural associations. So Marshall consulted and collaborated with Wordsworth on his planting schemes in various areas of the Lake District, and this included the planting of the Holme, which is now referred to as Homewood by the National Trust at Lowiswater, pictured here on this slide. And this was Marshall's largest plantation, which he acquired and planted in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. Though in the 20th century, the home was replanted to some extent, and notably into the shape of a crouching pheasant, as you do. I've kind of outlined that here on the slide, and you can kind of see sort of to the left the kind of beak of the bird as it's supposed to appear, but it is supposed to appear as a crouching pheasant. I'm not entirely sure why at this point, but this is what I've sort of found so far. And in this kind of picture and other pictures as well, we can still see evidence of the planting of larch higher up the fell, and the deciduous specimens, broadleaf specimens rather, further down and nearer to lowest water. Though Marshall intended the larch to act as a timber nurse of sorts for the trees lower down, the larch has remained above the broadleaf level here, as you can see on this picture. Currently, however, the site has been significantly impacted by the spreading of Phytophthora ramorum, a fungus-like pathogen that affects larch trees, and this has resulted in very recent and urgent felling in the area. So in Chris Routledge's recent cyanotopes of larch trees, the artist captures this phenomenon and our human responses to it. Larches with the disease are marked with an orange spot, and Routledge has captured this visually in the use of orange splashes of colour across the prints. So it's safe to say that the current state of the home is no longer what Marshall or even Wordsworth envisioned, and will undoubtedly change even more in the very near future. But to return to Wordsworth's guide, in this text, the author makes a further case for why the larch takes on different aesthetic characteristics on higher ground. He says that the winds would take hold of the trees and imprint upon their shapes a wildness congenial to their situation. Once again, placement of the tree is integral to Wordsworth's assessment of it. The wildness of the climate at a high altitude shapes the larch into a more agreeable form. The tree becomes a product of this wild environment and equally reinforces that wildness to the spectator. This reciprocal dynamic between the tree and place is evoked by Jones and Cloke in their discussions of tree materiality and the concept of arboriculture. They say, because trees generally grow slowly in relation to humans and other... Sorry, I think someone's gone through my slides. Because trees generally grow slowly in relation to humans and other beings, and because of their size, nature, and form, certain conditions of a place can become materially articulated in the form of the tree. Thus, they represent places in other ways. The body of the tree both embodies and contains a cartographic record of certain aspects of a place and represents these in a visible form which contributes to place milieu. So, for Jones and Cloke, trees become an embodied reminder of place and climate. The corporeal form of the tree is at once part of and a visual record for the topography in which it's situated. In this dynamic and reciprocal process, then, trees articulate place, and place shapes tree materiality. And I would suggest that for Wordsworth, the fells of the Lake District subsume and form the larch into a cartographic record of its environs. Sorry, I think someone's clicking through my slides there. 1 second, let me get back to where I was. Sorry. So now, as I've already covered the situation of trees and tree planting on fells, were of agricultural, aesthetic, ecological, and political concern in the 19th century, and now too. However, I'd also suggest that in writing to the period, notably when travel guides and literature of the region were developing and gaining popularity, the evidence of a boundary at the tree line, wherein trees that go beyond that space transcend some of these associations and transform into something different in the imagination of the spectator. So Martineau captures this space in the guide as she ascends a fell through straggling woodland, and notes that as the stranger arrives at a clump on the ridge, the last clump, that stranger then feels himself wholly free. So this is the region within which we might find Wordsworth's wind-formed larches. Trees that go beyond this boundary evoke and become part of a wilderness that outlies the impact of man's planting and caretaking. So for a visual example of these isolated individuals that sort of strike out, see these sort of larches on the slopes away from Homewood. So this is on the fell adjacent to the plantation at Homewood. I think this is the bottom of Burnbank Fell, if I'm correct. But these are kind of seedlings that have escaped the plantation and seem to be striking out on their own on the next fell over. And these trees on high ground are what John Muir would refer to as a tree mountaineer. The first use of this term appears in his First Summer in the Sierra, written in 1869 but published a little later. And here Muir describes a juniper tree in the following manner: a thick-set, sturdy, picturesque Highlander, seemingly content to live for more than a score of centuries on sunshine and snow, a truly wonderful fellow, dogged endurance expressed in every feature, lasting about as long as the granite he stands on. Surely the most enduring of all tree mountaineers, it never seems to die a natural death, or even to fall after it has been killed. If protected from accidents, it would perhaps be immortal. I saw some that had withstood an avalanche from snowy Mount Hoffman, cheerfully putting out new branches as if repeating, "Never say die." So the tree mountaineer is a tree of any species that appears to strike out and upwards in its placement and growth at high altitudes. These are often isolated individuals or small groups of trees that appear to thrive against the odds of the climate on higher mountainous ground. And in detailing this juniper in the Sierra Nevada mountain range, Muir depicts a picturesque Highlander that appears in its physical formation to be as enduring as the rock on which it grows. So for Jones and Cloak, who were mentioned earlier, differentiating the non-human agency of trees from mere anthropocentric views and formations in the eye of the spectator has been complicated by the failure to see their agency within their own ecological timescales and the differing velocities and rhythms within which these trees operate. And though the tree is undoubtedly anthropomorphized, personified here by Muir in its figuration of a mountaineer, the author's suggestions of the tree's physical existence occurring as a different and more long-term timescale than his own demonstrates an early sensitivity to a different kind of rhythm. So for Muir, the tree even appears to transcend geological scale. A natural death. This enduring arboreal existence is likened to something beyond the human or non-human in its exceptionality. It's equated with immortality. And in transplanting and applying this term into expressions of trees in the English Lake District, I'd like to highlight the contemporary botanical understanding of these elevated specimens in this specific region. So in a flora of the English Lake District, this was sort of published towards the end of the 19th century, so it's a later text. But in this text, J.G. Baker refers to 4 altitudinal zones at which vegetation changes. So zone 1 is the mid-agrarian zone. So this is from sea level to 900 feet. The examples that Baker gives are woods around some of the larger bodies of water. So around Windermere, Derwentwater, Ullswater and Bassenthwaite. Zone 2 is the super agrarian zone. This is 900 to 1800 feet above sea level. And for Baker, this is marked by the cessation of certain plants at that point. Zone 3 is the infra-Arctic zone. This is higher, and this is 1800 to 2700 feet above sea level. And the examples that Baker gives where flora is found at this level is red tarn on Helvellyn and sprinkling tarn on the north of Scafell. And then lastly, we get the zone 4, which is the mid-Arctic zone, and this is over 2,700 feet. And Baker seems to list the kind of summits of the highest fells in the lake, so from Scafell to High Street, and he says, here there is nothing but bare rocky hilltop with a very scanty vegetation of any kind. So not very much grows at this level. But to go back to zone 2 on this slide, Baker suggests that the only trees that go beyond this boundary are the rowan and the juniper. So when we look at these individual entries in Baker's book on these species, Baker notes seeing the rowan at 900 yards on Striding Edge on Helvellyn, and juniper also on Helvellyn, Grisdale Pike and Scarfell Pike. These trees are undoubtedly within that kind of range of freedom which Martineau refers to. Much more than this, Baker is unable to kind of clearly define the arboreal limits of the fells. Most trees seem to grow between 900 to 1800 feet, but there are individuals that transcend this limit too and kind of can't be contained by it. So whilst Baker doesn't refer to these botanical exceptions in the kind of same fantastical terms as Muir does, there's still a sense that the trees beyond and at the upper limit of zone 2 are noteworthy natural phenomena that exist beyond an ordinary, or should I say human, framework. And earlier than both Muir and Baker, Wordsworth provides a similar description of tree mountaineers on the Lakeland fells, though he doesn't describe them as such. He says, from low and sheltered places, vegetation travels upwards to the more exposed places, and the young plants are protected and to a certain degree fashioned by those that have preceded them. The continuous mass of foliage which would be thus produced is broken by rocks or by glades or open places where the browsing of animals has prevented the growth of wood. As vegetation ascends, the winds begin also to bear their part in moulding the form of the trees. But thus mutually protected, trees, though not of the hardiest kind, are enabled to climb high up the mountains. Gradually, however, by the quality of the ground and by increasing exposure, a stop is put to their ascent. The hardy trees only are left. So there are similarities here, I think, to his description of the wind-shaped larch that I mentioned earlier. In the upper regions of the fells, tree physicality is equated with ascending and climbing high up the mountains. And whilst these trees are described as hardy rather than immortal, they likewise gain a kind of exceptional ecological identity for the author. And these specimens defy the odds of the climate and thrive on mountainsides and tops. And this isn't the only description of climbing trees in Wordsworth's guide. A few pages later, Wordsworth refers to trees climbing up to the horizon and in some places ascending from its sharp edge in which they are rooted, with the whole body of the tree appearing to stand in the clear sky. Once again, these individuals are anthropomorphized into kind of corporeal forms by Wordsworth. They are climbing with their whole body. Undoubtedly, this human framing of such trees is an attempt to understand their growth within that place, a seemingly miraculous feat. In becoming equated with a mountaineer or climber, there's a somewhat paradoxical dynamic happening here. These trees help shape the wildness of their situation for the spectator, but the humanization of them is also perhaps a kind of way of forging a human, non-human kinship with that same place. They are at once relatable and alien entities, depending on the perspective of the onlooker. And through such kind of chameleonic expressions, it's fair to say that at a higher elevation, trees transcend the same cultural associations and social and political limitations that trees and tree places further down into the valley are subject to. In this respect, the conceptualization of the tree mountaineer becomes a kind of unique way of comprehending that terrain and reviewing our perceptions of trees more widely. So for the last part of my paper today, I'd like to explore a few kind of specific geographical instances of how tree mountaineers appear in the Lakeland works of the authors that I've already been referring to today. So in her Grasmere journal, Dorothy Wordsworth notes the aesthetic appearance of beautiful birches which appear on crags, And for Coleridge, in his notebooks, he often records his sightings of trees on top of fells. So take, for example, at the lower end of Ennerdale, he notes 2 large yews or hollies on the summit of Cragfell, and looking across from Wallercrag to the saddle of Helvellyn, he notes that he sees a tree and a bunch of juniper, I believe. In both of these latter instances, Coleridge isn't definitive in his species identification, presumably because of his distance from them. Nevertheless, they are striking components within the mountain range and his eyeline. And rather recently, Kerry Andrews has made the case that few guidebooks of the 19th century paid much attention to the higher ground in the Lake District, unless it could be readily accessed by car, coach, or donkey. However, in the personal writings of Coleridge, Dorothy Wordsworth, and Martineau's Complete Guide, there are textual instances of tree mountaineers at a closer proximity, which give a more comprehensive idea of their role for individual spectators in specific locations. In particular, and as Baker indicates in his Botanical Guide to the region, the rowan or mountain ash tree appears as a kind of recurring and notable species of this altitudinal materiality in these texts. So rowans are often notable examples of tree mountaineers because of their capacity to self-seed in shallow soil and in small crevices. On her route up Great Gable, for instance, Martineau recalls a mountain ash at some height that forms a kind of way marker to remind the hiker and tourists that they are on the right path. Equally, as she descends to Dye Head Tarn and Skew Gill, the author remarks that a small mountain ash comes in sight a few yards below, and a pile of stones erected in sport by some dalesmen is in front. These specimens become more than tree. They sort of transform into a natural signpost. And the openness of the surrounding fells means that the individual travelling through it relies upon this remarkable phenomena in order to navigate that place, and in Martineau's case, direct her reader too. So in Coleridge's notebooks on his travels in the Lake District and Scotland, he often refers to twistures, which are sort of defined as trees starting out of rocks, which their roots split as if with a wedge. And this in itself, I think, is similar to Muir and Wordsworth's conceptualization of climbing trees and their intersections with geological spaces. And across his notebooks, Coleridge notes a variety of these specimens. In Ascending Blencathra, or Saddleback, via Scalesbeck in August 1800, Coleridge noted a young mountain ash with one unripe and never to be ripe cluster growing athwart one of the pools in the beck. The one remaining cluster of berries on the tree is fixed in an unripened state because of its watery position. Moreover, a few yards further, Coleridge sees a small forest with a fine mountain ash over it, with a beautifully long, smooth bathing pool at its foot. So there's a distinct sense that these trees are notable visual landmarks in this elevated region. Moreover, the reader can see a kind of bowering impulse at work here in Coleridge's description of the trees athwart and over the mountain pool. And these trees aren't simply natural signposts for the mountaineer, but can also represent a kind of shelter on this open, high altitude terrain. So for Martineau and Coleridge, on ascending and descending their respective fells, the sight of a mountain ash not only provides visual interest within a relatively barren scene, but their placement within that landscape becomes a navigational tool that allows them to both comprehend and connect with these wild environments. So to conclude then, in the 19th century representations and records of the Lake District, the presence of trees on the fells, whether planted by nature or human hands, as I've hopefully shown, is shaped by a network of cultural associations, modes of observation, and approaches to cultivation. Much more than this, these associations and frameworks appear to shift through place, both in altitude and geographical location. In 19th century writings that I've looked at so far, trees at a higher altitude appear to have more non-human agency in their material form, ecological scale, and physical placement. Through human eyes, both then and now, these trees and tree mountaineers offer a way into rethinking and reframing the Lakeland Fells as an arboreal space as much as a geological one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was absolutely wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed that. My mind is absolutely bubbling at the moment. That was great. Just while we give the audience a moment to have a think about that, I'll just remind you that there's 2 different ways in which you can put questions to Anna. So so it is being recorded. If you unmute and turn your camera on, that will be visible on the recording. But if you'd like to ask a question, you're happy to do that. That's one easy way of doing it. The other way is to put a question in the chat. So I'm going to be manning the chat. If you haven't used Teams before, you should see a menu. Sometimes it's at the top of the screen, sometimes at the bottom, and it's near to where you have the camera picture and the microphone picture. Somewhere near there you should see a little bubble icon. And if you click on that, you can actually type into the chat. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that in case anyone wants to ask a question that way, in which case I will relay it across to Anna. And as I say, the other option is to simply turn your camera on so that I know you're wanting to ask a question, and then we can just unmute you. So are there any questions you would like to ask at this moment? Give everyone a second. Just while people are having a think, Anna, I'm not sure mine is really a question. It was just something I was really interested in terms of what you were talking about there, and it was that kind of Wordsworthian construction of the trees as you know, this sort of anthropomorphic gaze, but this idea of the trees as being kind of shaped by the weather, by the landscape. And I was really interested in that because of course he does that with humans as well, particularly in his poetry. So figures like the shepherd in the prelude, he really talks about them as being kind of, you know, constructed by the weather, that somehow they are toughened by it. They're almost, you know, they sort of become at one with the landscape because they are shaped by the weather in such profound ways. And so it seemed to me there was a really powerful link between the trees and the human beings in the landscape. So that was another step really in him maybe anthropomorphizing the trees, because he sees humans and trees as being subject to the same forces, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And there's an interesting point in the guide as well where he's talking about kind of the cottages of the sort of rural poor, for want of a better way of terming it. And it's kind of, these cottages are natural almost, they're kind of organic. I think he refers to them again as kind of vegetable. Like there's kind of obviously moss and trees or things growing out of it, to the extent that these human habitations, these domestic spaces, are also part of the wildness of it. So there's this sort of really interesting dynamic there. But you're right, I've not sort of looked at his poetry yet, just because my specialism is my comfort zone is prose. But I will be going on to consider the poetry. There's just a lot of it to navigate.
Yes. There is an awful lot, isn't there?
Like, yeah, I mean, I know there's like the Lawton U and the Borrowdale U.
Yeah.
And there's like some interesting things happening in that poem, in terms of kind of how the tree doesn't ever decay. So there's some interesting things happening there with that might compare with Muir's concept of the immortal tree as well. But I've still got to work through that. But yeah, it's an interesting sort of dynamic, certainly.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And going back to that idea of the trees as markers, I think in the Borrowdale years there is a real sense of that, of them. Yeah, it's a kind of signifier. It almost becomes like a cultural signifier, a cultural kind of landmark, even though it's a natural object. Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, so let me just go to the audience again. Do we have any questions coming through from the audience? Just going to check the chat. So I don't actually think we have any questions coming through this evening. That's
not a problem. If people have questions at later time, feel free to get in touch.
That's fine. I mean, there was another thing I want to ask. I mean, there's lots of things about the talk I want to ask you, but I was also really intrigued by your other project, the Rowan project, and the kind of cultural history of Rowans. So is that project going on alongside this one, and that's both happening simultaneously?
Yeah, they kind of this project in a way sort of sprung out of the Rowan project, because I'm interested in the Rowan as a kind of northern tree, like in a lot of kind of botanical and cultural writings of the 19th century and the 18th century. It's sort of depicted as the tree that grows best, sort of in the northern sort of hemisphere, and notably in the English Lake District and in Scotland. And so we started to come across all these kind of tree writings, of both Rowans and otherwise, and then that sort of developed into the sort of two projects, but they are sort of alongside one another, certainly. But as you can, I did cite a few sort of Rowan examples in there, so I'm always kind of looking out for any other kind of examples of Rowans, but they are a really kind of frequent species that appear, I think, across the Lake Districts, and at lower levels and higher levels too, because they just seem to seed anywhere. And this, seemingly the case back in the 19th century, and earlier as well.
Yeah, and again, there is a long kind of cultural legacy there, which I don't know a huge amount about, but them appearing in folklore and stories and so on. So I can imagine that's a really interesting story to track. I don't know, so you probably know the work of Fiona Stafford, and her work on trees. I don't think the Rowan is in her tree book. I could be wrong about that, but I don't know. Is it in there?
She talks about kind of witchcraft as well. There's a really great anecdote actually in Dorothy Wordsworth's journal. She basically records one instance where Coleridge comes to visit, and it's a really, really bad storm. He comes over by Grizedale and there's a furious wind, and he's carrying with him a branch of mountain ash.
Yes.
And he's also attacked by a cow.
Yes.
Like, this is
yes.
It's like a sentence, but it's like carried a branch, attacked by a cow, a furious wind. And I just love it because I want to know all the other details to this story.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if there's something kind of superstitious happening there, because they were associated with like the protection of cattle against witchcraft, and it's something we'll never know because it's a diary entry essentially. But I do like to think of Coleridge thinking he's been attacked by a kind of bewitched cow or something with this branch of Rowan.
And Coleridge being Coleridge, that's all too likely.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's lovely. In the current reimagining Wordsworth display around the house, they have actually now got the stickers, and they've got that little passage out, and they've got a stick across a chair with a little story.
Really?
So that story's obviously made impression on other readers as well. So
yeah, it's one I just highlighted when I read it, and that's just I think it's my favourite passage.
Really interesting. It's really interesting. I'm just gonna have a look at the chat. So we haven't got any questions. We've got some messages coming through. So love the Rowan, definitely a northern tree from Carol. And then Gail, not a question, but the observing for navigation. So for example, in walk books, it's still done. You need to recognise trees. Yeah, absolutely. So first what we ever did was saved only because I knew Gina Fisher's smell of gin. That's great. Yeah, and thank you for a great talk. Thank you, Gail. That's lovely. And so we have got a question coming through now from Christina. And it's a really interesting question actually. So was the fear of exotics in the Lakeland landscape strongly related to a fear of loss of English culture and heritage? Really interesting question. Thank you, Christina.
For Wordsworth, thank you for that question, Christina. It's certainly for Wordsworth, I think it is, as Scott Hess kind of argues in his book. I think for Wordsworth as well, it's not just English culture and heritage, but Lakeland culture and heritage. So it's a kind of very specific, localized kind of heritage that he was also consciously shaping himself through his own work. So it's not just a larch either. He sort of lists other trees, but it's this kind of idea that a lot of landowners at the time were planting the larch, and he sort of saw it as a non-native exotic that was intervening in his idealized images of the woodland, really. So I would agree with that. It's certainly a loss of sort of the culture he was shaping. So maybe it's not necessarily heritage, but it's heritage as it's happening, as Wordsworth saw it as well.
it's also on a par with what you were talking about earlier, isn't it? You know, his very sort of, you know, strict guidelines on what is appropriate housing, and it's exactly what you're talking about. You know, housing that looks like it's kind of grown up out of the place. It's made of the stone of the place, that it's got moss on the roof. It kind of, and so somehow, you know, he also critiques buildings that seem incongruous, that are out of place in that landscape. So I think it is also, as you say, it's connected to that. It's connected to his very specific ideas about the Lake District as being, from a pretty early stage really, he perceives it as a space that needs to be protected and you know, conserved in some way, and I think it's part and parcel of those ideas, I think. So yeah, thanks Christine. As she said, yeah, thank you, it makes a lot of sense, and a great talk again. I would wholeheartedly agree with. So final opportunity, we've just got another minute if anyone does want to quickly ask a question. We've just got someone typing at the moment, so I'm just gonna so we've got a question from Hannah, just asking if the paper or project is published anywhere as yet.
As yet, this is the very sort of initial findings that I've been doing in recent months, but I'm hoping to turn it into an article very soon. But yeah, this is it's not anywhere at the moment, so this is the early stages, but hopefully it will be soon.
And we're really lucky actually to be getting some research which is absolutely, you know, hot off the press, that hasn't been published yet, and we're kind of the very early guinea pigs, aren't we? And for this, so yeah, so do watch this space, and I'm sure, you know, if Anna puts out on Twitter or any of the platforms that it's been published, we will of course you know, repeat that and retweet and so on. So yeah, just lots of thank yous coming through. So that was great. I'm just going to very quickly add my email to the chat, because I'm just going to do a sort of final bit of an announcement about the talk series after I've given my thanks. So that should have come through now. Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, just a massive thank you to Anna for such a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed that. So many threads there, so many new ideas, and I really love that when you get a lens on something very particular like that, you know, like looking at trees, and it kind of makes you want to go back and revisit all of them from the primary materials, and it gets you to see things in a slightly different way. So I thought that was really illuminating, and I will certainly be pulling some of that through into our MA classes and discussions next semester. So yeah, really enjoyed that. So just a huge thank you to you, and just a little bit of practical admin from me. So this is actually our final Cultural Landscapes event of this particular academic year. So we'll be resuming our Cultural Landscape series in the autumn. And I just want to say that if anyone who is attending the event tonight isn't on our mailing list for those events and would like to be, you can just drop me an email, and I've put my email into the chat. You can just drop me an email and ask to go on the mailing list, and I will add you. You won't hear anything for a while, but you will be getting messages through from the autumn about the next series of speakers. And really all the way through, we've had some amazing speakers, not just this year, but for the past 3 years that we've been running the cultural series talks. It's been an absolute joy getting such a range of perspectives and ideas, and also new research. I think we're just really lucky to hear from people like Anna. So we've had another thank you coming through there from Bridget, saying thank you for such an inspirational talk, and that seems to be a perfect place to end. So please accept a virtual thank you and applause from me, Anna.
Thank you so for having me.
It's been great. And to everyone else, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you'll rejoin us in the autumn when we start our next series of events. So good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.